Hey everyone, I'm going to take a look at another Limit Hold'em hand today. And what made this hand memorable was that, unlike most of my hands that take place in a cash game, this took place at the final table of a horse tournament at the Wynn this past December. And so it was memorable because by losing this hand, which spoiler alert, I did lose the maximum here, I more or less crippled my stack and busted in fifth place with 5 remaining soon after. So obviously, when you play a limit hold'em hand that doesn't go well and lose all of your chips in a high variance spot where the pay jumps are pretty substantial, you feel I felt pretty broken up about it. But the reality is that it was an interesting hand, and I think after doing some analysis that I did not play it too badly. So we're gonna go ahead and take a look at this tournament hand today. 5 players left at the final table. The horse folds to me on the button. Everyone is very shallow. We've been 5-handed for some time, so the blinds have just kept going up, and as a result, everyone is very, very short stacked. I did take a look at a Munker Solver ICM sim for the situation, and it let me know that my open preflop on the button with King 9 offsuit was fine. So maybe another day I will actually go through some ICM Munker stuff for you guys here on the channel. But for now, that made me feel a little bit better that I didn't have to be insanely tight in the spot. We were in the money. It wasn't like we were on the stone bubble. But the reality is that I opened on the button with King 9 with the King of Clubs and the small blind 3-bet. And he's going to be playing pretty solid here, right? So we assume this is going to be a tighter than normal 3-betting range, but that didn't really affect my play that much in the hand, I don't think. Anyway, I called, and I was obviously already not very thrilled about the situation. The flop came ace-8-7 with 2 clubs, and remember, I do hold the king of clubs here. We can see here in, this is a cash game, obviously simulation, but the villain should basically bet his entire range, which I think he certainly would in the tournament situation as well. And first decision point is here on the flop. And one of the things that I was thinking in game was that I definitely would fold the flop if I did not hold the king of clubs. And it looks like my instinct was about right there. If we look at the king 9 combos here, it's only continuing with the king clubs or the 9 of clubs. I guess in game, I don't know if I would have thought about continuing with the 9 of clubs or not. I suppose I would have at least considered it more. That does seem to be very relevant here. One thing I noticed about this sim that's pretty interesting is look at the sort of hands that we're actually folding on this flop. They're a little bit stronger than I think some people would think. I mean, yeah, of course, King 9, King 10, Queen Jack, Queen 10, these hands all have a serious issue here, which is that there's an ace on the board, and so they're already very, vulnerable. But I do think people peel this spot fairly often with 2 big cards, hoping to spike a pair on the turn. And we can see that the solver is much preferring to continue with bad gut shots and lower cards here, and basically folding all of its King X high and low that don't have a flush draw or a backdoor flush draw, Queen X, Jack X, etc. Same thing here. So you see where all the folds are coming from, these high and middle cards. And the King 10, apparently King Jack is a little too strong here, although it's basically 0 EV. Yeah, so I did call in game. I didn't really give any consideration to raising, of course, and it does look like, in theory, it could be an okay thing to throw in a raise here every now and then. Turn was a Jack of Hearts, and Villain decided to check. And this makes sense for a decent chunk of his range. I noticed that Villain here in pile land is supposed to check 32% of the time. If we take a look at what his most likely hands are to check, it actually makes, I think, a pretty intuitive amount of sense. Kings is a very high frequency combo. Kings does not necessarily have a lot of value to betting on the turn here, right? He's up against, I have every ace X in the deck, and he doesn't really need to protect his hand from too much else. Also, a hand like King Jack is kind of the same as Kings in this situation. And then basically a Jack seems to want to check a lot for kind of the same reasons that Kings does, which is that it's like it doesn't beat an ace, it beats pretty much everything else. 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s all checking. And then an interesting pattern that emerges here is that when you get down to the small pairs, they start betting again, more or less for fold equity, protection, equity, whatever you want to call it. Try to fold out the peels. Let's say Villain does bet here. You can see that I do immediately fold hands that have overcard equity against those small pairs. Obviously, the rest of my King 9 combos, Queen 9 combos, but even these high and low cards like King 6 suited with the backdoor spades are just now folding. So there's a lot of incentive for the small pairs to bet here on the turn. Once Villain does check, I thought in game that my hand just makes a no-brainer bluff. I know that I have every ace X in my range here, and we can see that the solver agrees. It's betting all this ace X here. It's not doing any checking back for protection or pot control or anything like that. It just wants to get value. Now, obviously, in an ICM situation, you could make some counter arguments to this, but in game, I felt like an ace was a pretty strong holding here, and it wasn't going to bust me to lose the hand. It was just going to, significantly damage my stack. Things that I would be more inclined to check in the tournament are maybe like a hand like queens here, right? Like this hand, The solver thinks it's good enough to bet being protected by all the ace-x, but for me, this wouldn't necessarily make as much sense. And when we go to look at my hand, the king 9, we see that it's basically a mix. And there's a kind of a funky thing happening in POW here where it actually seems to prefer bluffing with the 9 of clubs rather than the king of clubs. And to be honest with you, I can't exactly figure out why. Sometimes these blocker effects are very, very nuanced, and it doesn't make that big of a difference in your EV overall. The best I was able to come up with was after you bet, it does look like Villain prefers to check fold with the king of clubs in his own hand, and with a hand like king queen. This is because, you know, the solver isn't really thinking, but it's quote-unquote thinking, well, I'm blocking flush draw combos with the king of clubs. So a 0 EV hand like king queen is going to be worse off if it holds the king of clubs, because Villain's going to have more pairs and less flush draws. That's really the only thing I could think of that seems to make that big of a difference, whether to bluff with the king of clubs or the 9 of clubs here. I did bet, and I did get called, and I was going to shut down on some rivers. However, the river came the 2 of clubs. And when the river comes the 2 of clubs, I think that my hand just has to barrel off here. I now basically have the nut blocker. I can get folds from those stubborn pairs that were waiting to see a safe river. I thought in game I could probably get 9s and 10s to fold, although blocking a king, having a 9 in my hand is not ideal. But we can see here that I have a ton of value here. In fact, I bet 88% of my range in theory in a cash game situation here. All my ace-x can get bet again for value on this card. I'm basically betting for value or a bluff, and literally the only hands that are ever checking are 3s, 4s, king queen, and a tiny little bit of king 10 that's giving up. But like, you know, basically every other hand in my range has incentive to bet for value or as a bluff. Queens is going for pure value here. How much 8x do we have? Really not much 8x, right? Yeah, almost no 8x, because that would have played differently on an earlier street. So yeah, it's basically just like a jack plus for value, and then all the bluffs. And we can see that king 9 off here is just a pure bluff. And if I look at the EV difference, it's a pretty substantial mistake to check here. Almost 4/10 of a big bet. So I felt fine about my play after looking this over. Villain did call me with queen jack suited, queen jack of spades, and we can see that his hand was well played. Basically, he gives 0 consideration to folding here. He unblocks some of my straight draw bluffs, and his hand just makes a very comfortable check call on the turn, check call on the river. Obviously, when your opponents don't bluff too much, you're pretty tempted to fold this kind of a hand, but in theory, it's just a well-played hand by him. And unfortunately for me, he had a hand he could not fold. I was hoping he'd fold something like 10s, 9s. Even getting king queen to fold is an excellent result here given the pot size. And there's some 8x that maybe considers folding too. The queen 8 of spades here we can see is in that range, although he probably doesn't have this hand pre-flop, to be honest with you. So yeah, a memorable hand, some close decisions for me in game, but overall can't say I was too disappointed with my play. If anything, I could just say that maybe the river card kind of induced me to put in one extra bet in a situation where I was probably going to give up, and sometimes that happens. But yeah, unfortunate result for me to finish 5th in that tournament with the pay jumps being so high, but a fun experience, and being able to find these bluffs at the final table of a big tournament I think can also be very beneficial to my game, because obviously I do think people tend to be a little bit more weak tight in these situations, and maybe I get the fold through against some players more than I should. So next time, I hopefully will get a better result or make some better choices when I get to those final tables, but it was a fun one and a memorable one. Let me know what questions you have about this hand or about the tournament, and I will see you guys in the comments. Thanks a lot.